So I think it's 9 o'clock. We should start on time. So welcome everyone, and welcome to Christina in Stockholm. She unfortunately couldn't be with us in real life, but I think it's great she's going to join to give her talk. This panel is jointly organized by EADI, which is the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, with Henning Melber, the president, and the EADI working group on post and decolonial perspectives on development, of which I'm co-convening. Basically the intention is that despite the fact EADI being the European association, of course that doesn't mean we're the Eurocentric association. So we seek obviously to broaden our network, to broaden the perspectives and the dialogues, and that's why we're thinking about post-decolonial perspectives and all these kinds of topics. The Post-Colonial Working Group is a very open group of scholars, but not only, so we're very open to all kinds of people who are thinking about these topics. Just look us up online and join. So there are many possible ways of engaging. I think without much further ado, we will start, and we're thinking of having it more like a conversation format rather than presenter audience hierarchies. And when we're talking before, Juan has called it questionization, which I think is quite nice term for let's question our ways of thinking, question each other, and engage in conversation. So what we're going to do, we have our 4 presenters, which are Juan Telleria from the University of the Basque Country. We have Hamdi Issa from Imperial College London, Esther Krunsbein from University of Kassel, but living and working in Uganda, and Christina Simeon from Stockholm. And I'm sorry about your affiliation. I didn't note it down.
Just give a week.
Okay.
Yeah. Also,
okay.
Well, I live in Stockholm, but my academic affiliation is with the Australian National University, which is a bit confusing. But I just submitted my thesis, so I'm in a sort of transition period. But I'm currently based in Stockholm, not Australia.
All right.
Which makes it easier to Skype.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So welcome, and I think we'll start with Juan in this talk.
Okay, I prepared a handout.
Yeah.
Make more easy the presentation. Okay, so I'm Juan, University of the Basque Country, and as you know, the panel is called Rethinking Development Research, Objects and Subjects in Development Studies, and some of the questions we have in the call for abstracts. Like what are the foundations of epistemologies in development studies, or how to overcome asymmetric relations, how to decolonize development knowledge. So in order to answer these questions, I've been analyzing how we understand culture in development studies. And generally I found like 2 main perspectives. One of them assumes that there is something universal called development based on universal rules and fulfilling universal needs. And on the other hand, we have something local, specific, diverse, which is culture. So the challenge from this perspective will be how to properly articulate this global universal thing called development and these specific things called cultures, which are diverse. And this is what I call development and culture. And on the other hand, we have a critical perspective which assumes that development itself is cultural. Development will be the mentality or the logic, the Western logic to understand human issues, humankind, progress generally. So this is what I call development as culture. So for this presentation, I'm going to locate myself in the development as culture perspective, and I'm going to analyze development and culture proposal, which is the UNDP's Human Development Framework. So the lens of my analysis, you see the figure, I have some lens, is the work of an anthropologist called Clifford Geertz, more specifically the second chapter in the book, The Interpretation of Cultures. In this chapter, Geertz is analyzing how we've been understanding human beings since the Enlightenment, for 2-3 centuries. And he says that we were following a very reductionistic and misleading understanding of humans for 2-3 centuries. And what he says is that this understanding of humans fits very well Western academia, but is hindering a proper understanding of human issues because they are complex, and this way to understand humans is hindering a proper understanding. And what's this way to understand humans? So it's the figure I reproduced there in number 2. He says that we've been understanding humans as a formation of 4 layers. The essential layers would be the biological one. Because we have a body, essentially we are animals, so somehow the essence of human beings would be being animals, the biological layer. But he says we are not only, he says this perspective, this conceptualization considers that we are not only animals because we have some skills which are rationality, intelligence, the ability to create knowledge, to share knowledge. So this will be the second layer, the psychological one. Thanks to this body and this rationality, we are able to articulate complex social formations. We are able to create institutions, to create rules. So this ability to create social formations will be the third layer, the social one. And finally, as we are living all over the world in diverse contexts, in diverse conditions, the diversity emerges. So this will be the fourth layer of this thing we call humans, the cultural one. So I found this critique of Clifford Geertz very inspiring and very interesting, so I started analyzing the history of the genealogy of this conceptualization of humans. And I found, as you can see in number 3, that, for example, in the 18th century, we can find this conceptualization of humans in the work of Rousseau. In the 19th century, we can find this conceptualization somehow in the work of Comte, but very clearly in the work of another very influential sociologist, Herbert Spencer. And in the 20th century, we can find this conceptualization in the work of another very influential sociologist called Talcott Parsons. So reading the work of these authors, what I found is that when they are speaking about the biologic layer, they speak about the body, they say that this body has to be strong, needs energy to fulfill the normal functions of a human being. So somehow they are speaking about health. When they speak about the psychological layer, they speak about this skill, about rationality, knowledge, the ability to transmit knowledge, to learn new things, so they are speaking about education. And when they speak about the social layer, they speak about coexistence, interaction, exchange, and they highlight the importance of work, markets, and property. So somehow they are speaking about wealth. At this point, I was researching this in my PhD, and my PhD was an analysis of the UNDP's Human Development Framework. So I found that somehow the UNDP is reproducing this conceptualization of human beings because the Human Development Index is precisely measuring health, education, and living standards, which is income per capita, so wealth. And the UNDP says that these are the 3 essential components of human life. So somehow they are reproducing this kind of understanding human beings criticized by Clifford Geertz. So the first conclusion of my presentation will be the UNDP could be another example of this line of thinkers, or in this case one institution, understanding human beings through this conceptualization of human beings. And at this point it's interesting highlighting that these thinkers, especially those in the 19th and 20th century, Comte, Spencer, and Parsons, they were explicitly evolutionists. They were assuming that there were some kind of universal rules guiding the evolution of humankind, guiding history. They were assuming that the West was leading this evolution, and they were assuming that somehow the West had a moral duty with these others to teach them, advise them how to get this modern stage. This is interesting for two reasons. First, because these characteristics are, I guess, the characteristic of development issues. And it's interesting because this way we can start answering the questions I was mentioning at the beginning. What are the foundations of epistemologies in development studies? Somehow the epistemological foundations come from this evolutionist framework. And this helps also answering the second question, how to overcome asymmetric relations, because within the evolutionist thinking, there is a huge epistemological divide between the subject and the object. The subject will be the one who knows, the one who is trying to generate this universal knowledge, objective, somehow a truth. This will be the West, because it's the one leading this evolution. And the object will be those who are not the West, and we have to analyze them in order to somehow teach them how to achieve this modern stage. So this is not, this subject-object relation cannot be symmetric. It's going to be inherently asymmetric. And finally, to conclude, the question how to decolonize development knowledge, well, it's a very big question, it's very difficult. However, my proposal is, I think that analyzing how we understand culture is very useful. It's somehow like a key to open the box of development knowledge, because once we start asking cultural questions, we open the door to reflexivity, to ask ourselves these things we are asking about others, and through reflexivity we find a way to somehow dissolve the certainties of these kind of discourses. So this will be the presentation.
Do you want to?
Yeah,
Your question?
Thank you for that. I also had sort of the privilege of reading these papers beforehand, so I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. In your summary section of your paper, you propose two strategies to overcome some of these challenges, and the first one hones in on sort of the importance of reflexivity, and it makes me think of my own research, which later I'll talk about, where I'm constantly stressing the importance of sort of well-meaning researchers, academics and policymakers to sort of that are pushing for the agenda of change to be conscious of their own privilege and power, and not to reinforce what we're trying to essentially circumvent. So I was wondering, for your research in practice, so that those people that are working in that space, what would this look like? What are some sort of practical steps that they could perhaps take to try and translate this into action?
In my case,
Yeah.
Okay, it's different in my case because I'm not researching the others. I'm researching somehow my culture. It's a Western institution, thinking like more or less is mainstream thinking where I live.
Yeah.
So I'm not dealing, somehow yes, it's an other, but it's not the case of going somewhere far and dealing with someone who is different. In my case, I'm dealing with my own. That's why when I was reading Gertz, I found it very inspiring because I realized I was understanding humans this way.
Yeah.
So in my case, of course, I have to apply reflexivity, but in this case, it's more realizing that I'm a researcher and they are an institution. They have a political duty. They have to produce something, and it's easier from the researcher perspective criticizing, and I feel the duty of proposing also. So reflexivity will happen, I think, in these terms. It's not the classical anthropological reflexivity of how to deal with the other. I don't know if it's clear.
And just one point that you mentioned in your talk was this idea that the UNDP, through their HDI, is reproducing this conceptualization of human beings. If the UNDP was to sort of, what would you say is sort of the first steps that they should do if they decided that they wanted to reframe or redesign sort of this HDI? What would you say would be sort of the initial steps? What should they start off with to consider?
That's the question. No, I don't have an answer. Indeed, I have another question to answer that question. And it's that we speak about decolonizing development thinking, development studies, And my point is that maybe we cannot decolonize development thinking, because development itself has a colonial, I don't know how to say, basis. So we can decolonize solidarity, we can decolonize empathy, we can decolonize fight, we can decolonize solidarity, I said solidarity, cooperation, but maybe development we cannot decolonize. So what the UNDP should do, I mean, in a kind of joke, I would say dissolve, but I know that's not the answer of a researcher, so I don't know. Maybe we cannot decolonize UNDP.
When you was doing your PhD, so you said it was around this space,
Yes.
did you have a chance to speak to people within UNDP, and sort of what were their perspectives on the HDI? Did they think it was an issue? Did they
Yes, but in technical terms.
Yeah.
I mean, they are not breaking the subject-object framework. They say they don't even think about that framework.
Yeah.
They assume this is like this, and we have to research them, and we have to measure them to make things properly. So the concerns were more about the measuring, if it is specifically, if it is right, if it is correct, if really we are measuring what we want to measure, but not in epistemological. The problems were not epistemological, were more technical.
Well, I've heard that before.
Well, is there anything anyone wants to add? There's still a few minutes, so if you want to chip in the conversation. Yeah.
Sorry for being late and making a lot of noise, that I would say first. But I just think the first question that you asked is, from a methodological point of view, is extremely interesting. So how can you raise the awareness? Well, my question would be, can you raise your awareness about how you perceive, understand, and act towards the other without meeting the other? Can you do that? Can you sit by your desk? And if I exaggerate, you're just reading books. Can you do that? And then actually raise your awareness about how you perceive and act towards the other.
Okay, but my other is the UNDP, let's say, and the UNDP, I can communicate with the UNDP two ways, speaking with them, and it's something I did in the amount I could. I cannot be there for 1 year, but I was with them speaking. And the other way I can do is, if I want to understand how they understand reality, what's their discourse, I have to go to the sources where they explain reality, where they say all point on on what's going on is in this report. So I analyze the report. So I don't have, my other is the UNDP, and I have two channels, speaking with them or emailing or whatever, and then reading and analyzing where they say here is where we give our point about development.
I was thinking about the first question, which is not really about but how you reflect, reflection. Yeah. That was, okay. I just think it's an interesting question, and we should keep it alive, because I think it's hugely interesting for development research.
Well, we come back in the open floor, because I think all the papers speak to each other very well. So I think we should move on to Christina, and then maybe discuss like overarching questions after everyone has spoken. So Christina Simeon, she will talk about development intermediaries in rule of law resistance, and I think we'll see a similar narrative of subject-object binary in her talk as in France. So
can you hear me okay if I speak like this?
Very well, yes.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody, thanks for organizing this Skype thing. Actually, to be honest, I think it wasn't until I found this panel that I realized that my attitude was actually post-colonial. And I learned from Esther's paper that post-colonial methodology is an attitude that is held by the researcher that is committed to post-colonial critique. And I was trained as a lawyer, then I entered the field of rule of law assistance as a practitioner, and that field in itself is very sort of focused on technical expertise, like judges, prosecutors, lawyers, We gain no training in development studies or anything of the kind. Most practitioners have no idea whatsoever of the post-colonial contours of that project. They think that the law and development movement started in the 1960s in the United States, and that they're doing a very good thing to bring the rule of law to places, called development settings across the world. And I would speak to practitioners who would say things like, we would ask them, are you working with the Sharia courts or the Sharia systems? Said, no, I'm here to build the rule of law. I don't engage with any non-state actors, which is, of course, also a strange division of the state and non-state. If they were engaging in any sort of new thinking or new approaches, it would be, in terms of thinking about working with the so-called customary justice systems, which in itself, is a classification that Westerners brought to colonial states. And, in that case, that also became like a model that foreign donors try to impose on developing settings as a way of incorporating these so-called informal or customary systems into a formal state system that they would work with and promote. So I sort of became interested in shifting methodological approaches because there wasn't happening a lot in the field. There was some critique, people saying, this is not working. We built a courthouse in Somalia, but nobody wants to go there and get their cases resolved. They want to sit outside under a tree instead. How come? We have this really lovely new building here. And I thought, okay, this is not going very well. So maybe we need to look at the practitioners, the people who are doing this work. Who are they? What are their backgrounds? Why don't they get that, what they're doing in Germany or Sweden is probably not going to work in Afghanistan or some other place across the world. So I started researching their knowledge, what they were doing, their background, and the result was quite disappointing because they often said that we have no idea what we're doing, and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, but this is a good job, and I like to be in a developing setting, and I'm being paid a lot more than what I get in a courthouse in Berlin. So that was a bit disappointing, but when I was doing all this research, I met a lawyer from Uzbekistan who was working under really hard conditions, being the so-called local staff for a EU-funded rule of law project. So he was the sort of middle person between the foreign donor and the Uzbekistan government actors. And he said that, I see these two sides doing the wrong things, and they're not communicating with each other, but they trust me. So I'm stuck here in the middle with all this information, and I don't feel like I can breach the trust of either side. I see things ending up really wrong, but there's nothing I can do in this position. So I realized that what he was describing was the typical middleman role. So he was translating between these development counterparts, but he also felt very frustrated because nobody was sort of trying to unlock his knowledge or ask him what was going on. And in his interview with me, he felt, as it was good to talk to somebody and that somebody was listening and showing some interest in that tricky position he was in. He also had to mediate between development counterparts when they had different understandings and got upset with each other. And he was always trying to make sort of the both sides happy in some way. And I started to think that maybe this is the sort of knowledge that we would want to learn more about to understand why development intervention in the field of rule of law end up going the wrong way. And my interest in Western practitioners then took me to Myanmar because after political transition, that became the latest hotspot for development and rule of law assistance. So everybody was sort of showing up and wanting to help Myanmar get the rule of law because, according to them, there was no rule of law in that country. Like Juan's experience, when I spoke to UN actors and the UNDP about my research focus, of course, they were not very interested because they wanted to know, so what substantial rule of law field are you looking at? Are you looking at land rights or the courts? And I said, no, I'm looking at you guys and the way you do development, and they were just not very interested, which I think is a common tendency in this field. Development actors sort of continue doing their thing and they're not very interested in critique, and they often probably don't know how to incorporate that into their work. And when I was discussing and explaining the field of my research, a common reaction I got was like, oh, that guy, or oh, the fixer. They would sort of laugh at that person in the middle as this funny caricature or character who would, go around to conferences, growing in size was, some comments I got because they were earning more and more money doing this development work. So they were described as these networking people rather than actually getting the work done. So they were not doing the legal stuff they were employed to do. But on the other hand, every foreign development practitioner and organization I spoke to, they were acutely aware of the inability they had to do any development work without this sort of person. So they were desperate to get that guy or an intermediary who could work as a translator, but not a traditional translator, but a conceptual translator. And they were also worried that they didn't know anything that was going on in relation to the local counterparts, because the intermediary was taking on everything, because the foreign actors did not speak the language, they did not know much about the culture in Myanmar. It was a country that was just opening up to the outside world. So there was this confusing dichotomy between desperate searches and the continued disregard for translator and fixer knowledge and strategies, which I found quite interesting. There was also this focus on, always saying that people in Myanmar know nothing about rule of law, they don't know what it is. And that was interesting too, because then how can you, attempt to build that or develop that if nobody there knows what it is? But the intermediary, again, would sometimes be described as knowing a bit more about what rule of law is than the government actors or the local counterparts. So they were sort of cherished for that. And I think, for decades we've seen from the colonial era that the intermediary has remained this sort of, well-known feature of the colonial project, but also development. But also, he or she has remained little regarded in terms of their influence and power. Not many researchers have gone to them and asked, what are the challenges you're fighting? What's going on, on a daily basis in your work? What are the strategies you use? And again, when people did understand my focus, they would say, oh, so are you looking at NGOs, or what's your focus? As if there was a predetermined answer. Instead, I wanted to know who was playing an important intermediary role. So I asked different counterparts, like who's your key guy, who helps you reach out to local counterparts, etc. So I think that's one of my key messages, that we need to stop viewing intermediaries as a neutral translator or facilitator, the local contact, and we need to look a bit more into what they're doing, and studying them not just for our knowledge and development, but also looking at the way they create knowledge, so the way they act as knowledge producers. And I mentioned one example when it comes to translating the term rule of law in Myanmar. What I saw there was that foreign actors come in with this term, rule of law, which in Myanmar translates directly as law and order. So of course the generals were very happy to discuss rule of law because they want law and order. And then when you went from the negotiating table and the meta code you had up there of talking about rule of law to implementation stages, you saw that, oh no, in fact, we're talking about human rights abiding institutions, but these generals and the military, they want law and order. That's not going to work because the UNDP does not want to support this. Intermediaries, they were working hard there in the middle space with translating this term that foreigners came in with, and they did not want to talk about rule of law at all because it translated so badly. So they would talk about things like fairness, accountability, justice, and trust. So about 5 years into foreign actors' operations, they also started to realize that, we can't say rule of law, we need to talk about access to justice. Then they realized, oh no, there's actually no term, there's no such thing as justice in Myanmar. They don't understand what justice means. Let's talk about trust instead. So instead of sort of unlocking this knowledge from someone who knows what's going on in a middle space, it took them 5 years to realize that we're on the wrong terms here. We're talking about the wrong thing. Do I have stop?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
American.
So I'm just saying one thing. So, but those sort of change in discourse and
research and to answer many things. So I have two questions. One is very concrete, it's more curiosity than academic. And the second one is more academic. The concrete one, the specific one is, I can see this kind of the profile of this kind of intermediaries in a lot of countries. I've been working with them and I can see what kind of people are. Usually probably they got these translation abilities because they were living abroad for a while, or they were studying abroad, or they have family abroad and they were there, or they were working with an international business, or they were working with an NGO or something like this. So my question is, in Myanmar, which has been so isolated for so long, what kind of profiles you find? What kind of people is doing this intermediary task, and how they got these abilities to intermediate?
This was a surprise to me as well. When I started my research in Myanmar and I started sort of mapping these intermediaries, after a while I started asking them, where did you study English? Because what everybody would say was that I studied English at the American Center or the British Council. And at the American Center and at the British Council, they were teaching a lot more than English. So these two organizations or institutions were able to remain in the country to some extent and have some activities that were covered as English teaching, but then they would incorporate some political books in that teaching. There were also, for example, an American diplomat who would then support the students at the English training. These students were National League for Democracy supporters, so they were all from the NLD movement. They were student politicians, underground politicians, but young people mostly, from the universities, from the student unions. So they often they were engaged there for years. They had big networks with these guys who were studying with them. And this often led to them being able to get a scholarship to study abroad. Sometimes this happened, in the 2000, somewhere in between 2000 and 2010, that they were actually they managed to get approval to leave for 6 months to go to the US or something like that. And some of them were able to leave right after transition or around those years to study abroad. So of course they're bilingual, they're often quite young. They wear Western clothes, they know how to speak about development language. They often work for some livelihoods organizations or with the UNDP on less sensitive areas of development. Like the UNDP and UNODC, they've been present in Myanmar for over 30 years, but they worked on quite not as sensitive topics as rule of law. So then these intermediaries can transition and start to work on other topics. So yes, that's sort of the profile. So they were able to have that connection with foreign actors also during military rule, but in a less formal and quite a sort of not so much, but a little bit.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is more academic. In your paper and in the presentation, you very well describe this line between the global understanding of law and rule and the local perspectives on somehow the same topic, and you point that in the middle there is some people who have a lot of influence, power, and it's very important. So I found, when I was reading the text, at the same time I found that there is a similar line, a parallel line between the reality in Myanmar and the paper I'm reading, which is written in somehow a global language, it's a global narrative. So again, we find another line. In this kind is not development practice, in this kind is development studies or research. and we have a reality there. We have the paper, which is like the global translation of that reality. So, two questions. First, who will be the intermediary in this case? I mean, making a parallelism between what you describe in your paper and the reality itself. Who is the intermediary? Is it you? Do you think that some people is the intermediary and you are just representing what they say? It's not a question, it's just opening the...
Yeah.
And then the second part is, okay, in your paper you say that generally this translation is coming top-down, generally translating only the global message to the local communities. And I was thinking that maybe what academia is doing, researchers, what we are doing generally, is translate the other way, translate the local reality into global terms. So, what do you think? Or?
And so, that my disclaimer for my whole PhD research, and which I think is an important point to make, and that I see little about, because you have a lot of emerging researchers and seasoned researchers who study Myanmar, and they're engaging in commenting on the political situation, and they're commenting on the Rohingya situation. I never felt comfortable being able to say anything about how things are in Myanmar. I'm an international practitioner who comes to this field as a foreigner and international. But I think that also gave me the benefit of understanding how it is to enter a completely new cultural and linguistic setting, not knowing much about the place and trying to do development work there. So I myself would be offered to have a fixer to help me. So I talk a lot about that and how entering the field as a foreigner might have been a beneficial starting point for my research. I think that and I suggest that somebody would do research where they embed themselves in a local area in Myanmar and study translation and intermediaries from the sort of the bottom up. And that's not what I did. I was in Yangon, which was emerging. New actors were coming in. There wasn't much rule of law activities going on. So the setting looks a lot different now. And I was doing an ethnography with the international crowd. So I was, going to their parties and talking to them mostly. And that was the perspective I had. And I think that's the only perspective I could have had as a foreigner at that point. And being trained as a lawyer and working in a field that is highly, top down. So what I wanted to do is sort of unpack and bring out the voices of the intermediaries rather than saying that this is how things look like in Myanmar or this is the exact translation of rule of law. I'm not trying to do that really. I'm trying to say that this is what intermediaries tell me. I don't know what, the different translations of justice, or I'm not even going to try to comment on that, but this is what the intermediaries tell me that they're experiencing as a challenge in translating the rule of law.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think that connects very well to Esther's talk, because the whole question of how to enter a field that or an environment that is not yours, and what kind of narratives get translated into what kind of realities. Esther is going to talk about subject and object positions regarding knowledge projection, in particular in the interview situation. So, Esther.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to share some experience from my doctoral research study that I'm currently undertaking in Busoga, a kingdom in the eastern part of Uganda. So let me start with a quick look at the theoretical basis. The approach to epistemology in my work is built on Boaventura de Sousa Santos' epistemologies of the South. So its aim is to recognize the other as an equal producer of knowledge and to access suppressed, silenced, or marginalized realities instead of constantly trying to teach, which has been the attitude of the global north towards the global south so far. So post-colonial or decolonial research puts a very strong emphasis on self-reflexivity. In addition to all aspects concerning one's own positionality, This means to be aware that concepts from the global north are not universal. For example, Alkov warns that theory can never be neutral and truth can never be objective because what is accepted as truth depends on the positionality of the speaker. So challenging the universality of theories from the global north is also among the measures suggested for post-colonial research by other theorists like Randram and Match, for example. Furthermore, they state, quote, "There will always be degrees of incomprehensibility and continuing spaces in between, but working through these in-between spaces can bring moments of enlightenment, glimpses of the world through someone else's reality," end of quote. Hosseini Dilraujo and Casting also use the metaphor of researching in between. They are borrowing it from translation, which underlies inevitable shifts of meaning when trying to transfer a message from one language to another, just like research trying to transfer the voice of the other to the scientific context. Another important aspect of post-colonial critique is that the researcher should not claim to be speaking for others, especially not for people from the global south. So Alko, for example, in spite of her disapproval of the claim of speaking for others, does not want the discursive privileged to stop their research in the global south, for example, or in other settings, but to practice a more receptive listening. Otherwise, it would mean to ignore one's political responsibility as a privileged person. Hofer also laid forth the hypothesis that intellectuals, instead of claiming to speak for the subaltern or the people of the global south, should listen to them. According to him, listening is an act of authority because it is a precondition for the act of speaking. If nobody listened, no act of speaking has taken place. So the decision whether to listen or not, or whom to listen to, is a political one. In an article on feminist research, Rothman defines her role towards the women she researched on as political representation as well. Quote, "I am their representative to the world that reads my words, hears me speak," end of quote. Hofer and Kapoor likewise demand sincere openness to unexpected answers or statements uttered by the subaltern from a self-reflexive post-colonial researcher. So some words on the qualitative interview as such. As the aim of qualitative interviews is to understand the world from the subject's point of view, as for example Quali and Brinkman state, they are centered on the interviewee, which means that even semi-structured forms can be handled flexible in the interview situation. Nonetheless, I must acknowledge that the interview has a lot of potential disadvantages, especially in a setting or with a group that the researcher does not belong to. The danger is high that interviewees do not trust or understand the researcher and, as a result, give answers that are either not candid, honest, or helpful to the research question. Still the same danger lies in many participative research methods. The researcher may hope to gain more trust from the researched because she's giving them more power over the research, but of course there's no guarantee for this hope to be fulfilled. So my approach is that a general lack of trust or understanding can only be become by the attitude of the researcher and not by a method as such. So how to decolonize the interview? We have to look at 4 aspects at least, ones I'm looking at mainly. One is power relations in qualitative research. Lincoln lately emphasized the importance of making power relations subject to discussion, instead of laboring under the illusion that they can be overcome completely. Hosseini Dilraujo and Casting likewise state that even in post-colonial research, to overcome power asymmetries completely is desirable but unattainable. Hence, they should be named and not concealed. The extent to which power imbalances can be overcome in the research process depends first of all on the attitude with which the researcher prepares and conducts the research. For the interview, this means that the researcher should let go as much of the control over the interview situation as possible. Or as Ross states it, quote, "to place me, the researcher, in vulnerable moments in order to enable moments of empowerment for research participants," end of quote. In my ongoing research project, I tried to attain that goal, for example, by letting the interviewees decide when and where to meet. First of all, they could take an important decision concerning our encounter, and secondly, they could choose a venue for our meeting that they felt comfortable with. Secondly, they were informed from the very beginning that there would be no financial compensation for their time. That meant that put me, the researcher, in the position of a supplicant. They knew that the success of my project depended on their goodwill. To offer money to them would have changed that power constellation in favor of the researcher. But I have to add here that this might not apply to every cultural setting. There are also other cultural settings where this approach would not work. So it's very important to first of all get informed on that before taking such decisions. So in the particular context I was working in, the procedure I had to follow in order to gain access was a bureaucratic one. It was very important in order to get access and also to win the trust and the consent of potential interviewees, to follow a certain bureaucratic procedure and to make sure I have the support of all the concerned authorities. So this was a very time-consuming process, but very important because it showed respect for local hierarchies, which is a very important virtue in the interviewee's culture. Nevertheless, it is still the researcher deciding when and how to allow such moments of empowerment for the research participants, and also what to do with the research results. So this is true for any research method, even if it is participative. It is still the researcher from a position of power who decides which research method to use. The second point I'm looking at is the influence of the researched. Law states that open-ended interviews, quote, provide opportunities that empower participants by enabling them to focus on what is important to them rather than to researchers, end quote. I would go further than that by attributing this quality to semi-structured interviews as well. For example, in a question asking the interviewees about things that were not there in their childhood, that could make one of them tell about things that people used to make themselves, like medicine, soap, salt, instead of buying them in the past. And another one tried to sensitize me for the problem of so-called improved seeds, because nowadays the seeds, they are getting produce crops much quicker, but without the taste and the positive health effect they used to have in the past. So that small example shows that even in such a semi-structured interview, the questions can be set in a way that allow a lot of different topics to come in depending on the priorities of the interviewees. As Husseini Daraj and Kerstin aptly point out, the demands of post-colonial critique towards research, like making research questions more flexible to the influence from the researched, are perfectly legitimated, but sometimes not fully attainable, be it due to global power constellations or to academic conventions. In my case, for instance, the topic itself was not so flexible, but I was open to the influence of the interviewees on certain aspects. So after the first set of interviews, I sat down, I looked at them, and tried to see what came up so far and what had to be considered in upcoming interviews. So for example, at that point, saving on credit groups came in, which was a topic that I planned to leave out because I made a bad experience with them in my professional life, so I feared that I might not be able to judge them fairly. But still, during the first set of interviews, I noticed that so many people talked about it and they also cherished them a lot. So I had to, is that my alarm? Okay, let me speed up. So I had to surrender to the priorities of the interviewees and put more emphasis on that topic in upcoming interviews. The third point is language and translation. Kapura recommends basing on Spivak to learn a language of the Global South. So I tried to learn the language of my interviewees during my first year in Uganda. Still, the role of the translator was very important, be it in a linguistic and also in a cultural sense. which I cannot talk about so much right now. A quick word on reciprocity, which is the fourth and last point. And the most challenging aspect, especially when we're talking about a doctoral dissertation like mine. Of course, if everything goes well, I will earn a doctorate in the end, so there is no equivalent I can offer to my research. So what I can do is, for example, trying to establish a reflux of knowledge. I'm going to have feedback workshops for them where they can access the research results and also comment on them. My conclusion also has to be cut a bit short. The most dangerous characteristic of the interview, for sure, is that researchers might be tempted to conduct it without prior or concomitant reflection. But as I have tried to point out, the obligatory preconditions for any kind of post-colonial research is intensive, preliminary, concomitant, and subsequent self-reflexivity, as well as a critical positioning in terms of power relations. Christina has kind of spoiled the surprise. Post-colonial methodology is an attitude and not a particular set of methods. Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, so should I ask my questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that one of the strategies to empower research participants is to let them decide where to meet. And in your case, most participants wanted to meet in their homes. And so from my experience in Myanmar, especially since being a female, it would have been very culturally inappropriate for me to, for example, visit a male lawyer's home. And though I did get those suggestions, but I was advised definitely not to do that. So I wonder, how do you balance being or decolonizing the interview situation with other issues such as security and cultural sort of, or what's inappropriate and not appropriate, or what's appropriate and not appropriate in this specific setting? So that's is there a gender aspect that you might have to take into account when it comes to how you conduct the interviews? And should I ask the second question straight away, or do you want to?
Go ahead if you want.
Okay, and the second question is, you mentioned that you had to overcome your prejudice of savings and credit groups in order to be post-colonial. So my prejudice towards rule of law actors and foreign donors remained throughout my research, but I was trying very hard to hide that. But was I still being post-colonial, or was I not post-colonial because I did not overcome my prejudice?
Okay. The first question was about the venue for the interview. So I think, it is difficult to answer your question. Of course, there are gender aspects, cultural aspects that have to be considered. I mean, normally when you let the interviewee decide if it's a decent person, he or she might tell you the culturally appropriate answer. Of course, if you got offers of male lawyers to visit them at home, which is not appropriate, that's a problem. In that case, I think you need people around. You need, for example, your intermediary, your translator, or cultural advisor, somebody who helps you in such situations to see what is really appropriate in the cultural context. But I think in most cases the interviewees are competent to decide where they want to meet and what is appropriate for them and can also be appropriate for you, because they also know you're a foreigner. Yeah. Does that hit the point a bit, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Then the second question, so you remained with your prejudice against what? Development and?
For foreign donors and their rule of law assistance activities.
Yeah, I think it is very post-colonial to remain with that prejudice.
Okay, great.
Yeah, because as I tried to point out, to overcome the prejudice, in my case, was very important because I came with the prejudice as a Western researcher, but my interviewees were thinking differently. So it was important for me to even have a closer look at those savings and credit groups in the upcoming interviews in order to understand what they like about them, how they help them, and how I can try to base on their experience rather than mine in judging them. Okay.
Yeah.
I would say that prejudices before you contact them. Once you contact them and you try to understand the dynamics and the logics, is your judgment, not your prejudice. So, I mean, we always have prejudice and we always judge, so don't worry.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so in continuation of Esther's reflections on power knowledge divides and all these struggles of reciprocity and everything, I'd like to move to Handi, and she will talk a little bit about political, cultural and cognitive structures of international knowledge hierarchies and especially asymmetric ignorances. So.
Hi, so I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London, and my research focuses on, I look at the diffusion of healthcare innovations across country borders, and I argue there's a merit in high-income countries learning from sort of the great ideas happening in low-income countries as well. I'm most interested in this concept known as reverse innovation. It describes the process whereby a high-income country learns from sort of the ideas happening in a low-income country and brings that knowledge back into their setting. In the realm of rethinking development research, my point of departure is our healthcare systems. That's inclusive of both the clinical and the academic institutions. And I invite a discussion around the taking for granted norms and hidden assumptions within these institutions. So my paper is considering sort of like a conceptual think piece. It's part of a working paper, but it also forms the foundation to my thesis. And it explores the middle grounds of the theoretical perspectives that perhaps can help with empirical studies that try and navigate these tensions between high-income countries and low-income countries when you're thinking about the diffusion of knowledge. And I argue that the execution of reverse innovation in these spaces perhaps creates this necessary alternative discourse. So many people would argue that the international development architecture, on the whole, is categorized by an asymmetry, where you see predominantly a unidirectional flow of finances, knowledge, and human resources. However, across the global health spending paradigm, at least in the UK, these narratives are starting to shift towards the idea of reciprocity, shared learning and co-development. We're starting to categorize this need for mutual learning in our global health systems. In healthcare, the reverse innovation agenda is motivated in part by the unsustainable growth in healthcare expenditure in the US and the UK, and that's why it's gaining a lot of traction in that spaces. And given these unprecedented challenges, there's likely to be a genuine need to learn from low-income countries. But the empirical evidence for bias against low-income countries is compelling. If I start off with an example, which was perhaps the first attempt to reverse innovate in the UK, the Brazilian community health worker model is considered to be one of the most successful examples of primary care reform. It's shown to be cost-effective and has a high user satisfaction. A 2013 paper describes the journey that health system leaders went through in an attempt to explore the possibility of piloting this in a bias against ideas because of where it was successful. And they actually said that some local stakeholders expressed serious doubt about the possibility of a country like Brazil having something to teach the UK. So fundamental to this is an attitude that knowledge from high-income countries is superior and cannot be overlooked, but ideas and innovation from low-income countries can be. At the moment, there's a paucity in well-designed and well-controlled studies that examine specifically the geographical bias in individuals. But through the work some of my group are doing, there is some evidence to suggest that, at least in English clinicians, when you change the source of a research abstract from a high-income country to a low-income country, that significantly and negatively impacted how that research was rated. And similar findings have been found in US public health academics. So the empirical evidence suggests that there's a presence of cognitive bias in knowledge production and dissemination, which in some respects is a form of microaggression that's perhaps obliged to these distortions and reductions in low-income country knowledge that we often see sort of in international development architecture. So in the context of innovation diffusion in healthcare, theoretical perspectives can be sort of useful in allowing us to see what components are at play. In this paper, we draw a reference to 3 lenses: the literature on post-colonialism, the literature on power, and the literature on organizational learning. In no way are we suggesting it's an exhaustive list, but rather it's sort of a way of introduction to conceptualizing perhaps the opportunities reverse innovation offers, at least in the healthcare space. So, reverse innovation and the politics of knowledge sources. If I was to start with global knowledge hierarchies, one of the most significant reference points is the work of Edward Said. Through his work, we begin to understand how the impact of imperialistic structures of the past have lent a hand to sort of the creation and manipulation of how we understand knowledge today. In 1978, Said argued that scholars in the East cannot afford to ignore what goes on in the scholarly journals, institutions of the US and Europe, yet the converse is not true. In there, he was describing the presence of an asymmetric ignorance whereby knowledge created by the West cannot be discounted by non-Western societies, but emphasis for an equivalent acquaintance with knowledge generated outside of the West was absent, and is perhaps somewhat absent even today. So asymmetric ignorance is not just a case of European history. A quick glance at our dominant knowledge structures for academic research production illustrate how research outputs and coverage are skewed heavily towards high-income countries. So much so that a recent bibliometric analysis of global scientific production that was looking at research on global health inequalities produced over the last 50 years found that high-income countries disproportionately dominate first and co-authorships. So we can see that there's this presence of power at play within our academic institutions. And to help us gain a deeper understanding of the subtlety of power in high-income country dominance of science and healthcare research, it would be important to dissect the knowledge and power dichotomy. And for this, the Foucauldian analysis becomes really useful. Foucault's analysis of high-income countries' approach to science illustrates the ability of power to elevate certain statements to true status through selective promotion, intentionally discounting counter-statements through what he calls regimes of truth. He explains to us that each community has their own regime of truth. So at the macro level, that could allude to groups as specific as your cultural, political, religious groups. At a more micro level, that might allude to groups as specific as your academic communities. So how that translates to this research is that within these academic communities, it suggests that they have regimes of truths that shapes the type of discourses that they're willing to accept, and the sources that they go to identify those discourses, and then the mechanisms they use to filter out what would be a truth status and what would be a false status in academic research. So one regime of truth that reverse innovation upends is this belief that high-income countries are the providers of great ideas and innovations to low-middle-income countries, yet it cannot happen the other way. As a way of example, perhaps an instance where the application of this regime of truth is apparent in the research. A research that my supervisor and his team done, what they were doing was they looked at, it was a qualitative study looking at the barriers and enablers to reverse innovation in the US context. A proposal for a model found to be successful in the US healthcare setting, following successful implementation in 12 different countries, although 12 no-middle-income countries, received disproportionate resistance until knowledge has surfaced that the idea had been adapted to the UK as well, and then suddenly the stakeholders were like, oh, the UK, great, it would probably work here then. The researchers imply that it's more palatable to persuade a stakeholder if innovation has been trialled in a country that doesn't upset their regime of truth. Reverse innovation is ultimately connected to this learning dynamic that encourages learning across country borders and in both directions. So if we just quickly look at reverse innovation and organizational learning, the process of knowledge transfer and the diffusion of innovations across countries and within organizations requires two simultaneous mechanisms to take place. The first and the most obvious is learning, but that only represents one side of the coin. On the flip side is this often neglected notion of unlearning. To enable an unbiased approach to where we may look for ideas and innovations, reverse innovation elicits this need to unlearn obsolete traditional methods that favor high-income countries. So the theoretical literature and sort of the scholarly metaphoric contributions illustrate the residual effects of colonialism in our institutions and perhaps how it penetrates through all stages of knowledge output, from the publication process to authorship to the peer review procedure. So in this paper, what we do is we sort of provide or propose 2 or 3 useful approaches to circumventing the global knowledge asymmetries in our international development architecture. The first recommendation is around the sequential steps prior to knowledge production. So the role of prestigious journals, peer review system as the custodians of knowledge grants the disproportionately high-income country reviewers with this some sort of privilege in determining whose idea is given a platform and whose idea is not. So dismantling this requires the academic community as a whole to really invite a more equitable geographical representation of their editorial reports. And then the second recommendation is around the sort of the othering process that occurs in knowledge production. Today's global flow of healthcare innovation demonstrates a persistent equity deficit. Overcoming this requires us to reframe sort of the structures of the international development architecture that currently places low middle-income country knowledge and ideas on the periphery. But whilst it's necessary to narrate the significance of low middle-income country actors in knowledge production, without their voices in this narration, we unintentionally create them as non-participants in this conversation of worthy knowledge production. So it's really important that well-meaning individuals like ourselves who are pushing for this agenda of change remain constantly and consciously aware of their own language and use and how it may impact sort of this us and them dichotomy that we're trying to erase. A great emphasis in the decolonizing knowledge debate is that great writing is great writing regardless of the writer. The reverse innovation agenda emphasizes that good ideas are good ideas irrespective of the source. Although the dynamics differ, the underlying objective is similar, to reposition the knowledge canon away from this sort of restrictive monolithic Western perspective towards appreciating a multiplicity. And whilst the decolonization movement in recent years has seen increasing calls to decolonize science, geographical knowledge, and the institutional memory, unfortunately it's sort of received limited attention in the global health space. At the most basic level, international efforts and calls to action for global development illustrate that the notion of global health itself is synonymous with health in low-middle-income countries when the term is supposed to be comprehensive. So as the decolonization debate gains traction, it begs the question if now is the time to call for decolonizing global health. For me, really, the answer is not simple, but the debate has revealed numerous lines of fracture within our current academic knowledge structures. And what is clear is that the sort of the business as usual model, where high-income countries teach the rest and pay no heed to sort of the great ideas that low-middle-income countries have, is highly unlikely to bring about the innovative changes that high-income country health systems like the NHS in the UK so crave. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the theoretical framework of your paper is very convincing. So I was wondering about whether you have some practical advice how to implement that reverse innovation in healthcare. For example, in your paper you mentioned Frank Lowell's thinking space. Could you say a word on how it could work in practice?
So you asked about how we can implement reverse innovation. Are you asking how we can implement reverse innovation?
Yes.
I think that's the example I gave of Frank Lowell's thinking space. So Frank Lowe, thinking space. He's a psychotherapist in the UK, and what he does is in his clinic, called Clinic, and what he does is he creates this space where in mental health you have this, what they found with mental health practitioners is that the patient and the relationship between the patient and the doctor is often has this power relationship, so it's very hard for people to overcome their own mental health issues if they're not in these safe spaces. So he created these spaces where those clinicians who also probably have some prejudice against people suffering from mental health were able to openly talk about sort of any prejudice they have concerning race or concerning any of the issues that these patients usually present with. So that idea of having these spaces within our institutions where we can openly talk about our prejudice, because in no way through this reverse innovation agenda am I suggesting that nobody has a prejudice, but the idea is that we become conscious of our biases, and then when we're conscious of our biases, when we acknowledge them, we're able to then find ways to manage them. So it's about creating these spaces. So if I give you an example of, actually in my research, what I study is international health partnerships, and I believe that could be a possible vehicle for reverse innovation. Reason being is because international health partnerships, they allow a relationship between high-income countries and low-middle-income countries, and in its purest sense, it's this neutral place where ideas and innovations are supposed to spread between two different countries. I study the Norwegian healthcare system, the Norwegian approach to international health partnerships, because what Norway have done is that they've created this system whereby they don't send Norwegians overseas just to impart their knowledge. They actually do an exchange mechanism where if a Norwegian is going overseas, they will receive someone from that low-middle income country as well, because they believe that's the sort of creating this space for reciprocity. And that's sort of one way where you can share your ideas as you go overseas, but also that low-middle income country counterpart will come over here and sort of share their expertise in that clinical space. But before they do that, what they do is they take all their participants on a training course, and again they create this similar space that Frank Lowe talks about, where they create this environment where it's a safe space and everyone can talk about any prejudice they may have or concerns about going to X country. And it's supposed to be the safe space where no one's judging you, and then people can, when you articulate sort of your viewpoints, you then realise how ridiculous they sound out loud. So it just it makes people more conscious, but also they have this space where no one else is judging them, and then they can talk through sort of their process. Why do they think they can't possibly learn from Africa? What is it that they think? Why do they think that person cannot bring anything or contribute anything? So it's this idea that you just create these spaces where you can openly talk about and air out any prejudice that you may have. So, but I believe one way that perhaps high-income countries can be open to learn from low-income countries, or this vehicle for reverse innovation, is perhaps through international health partnerships.
Thank you.
Okay. So it's now my role to take over as a moderator, and we have 17 minutes, if I can trust the time indicated there. I think the best we can do is we gather from all of you who want to add something, to comment or ask. And then we have a final round of the 4 presenters, and then I will just close by quickly summing up. Is that okay? Aram, you wanted to say something?
First of all, thanks for the presentations. I found all of them were really interesting, and I'm going to comment and ask only one question to Juan, so not to take too much of the time. Maria Eriksson-Baas, who is also here, has written about post-development that it has to deny its own influence on the mainstream in order to preserve the critical self differing from the mainstream other. Would you think that could also apply to your analysis of the UNDP, maybe? Because the UNDP actually has implemented the critique already in setting up the HDI instead of the GNP, and also in adopting Sen's definition of development as freedom of choice. So it's not for us to say. And on the background of this, I would like to ask, okay, what do you think in terms of this adding culture, adding this maybe 4th dimension? Would it make sense to add this cultural dimension, or maybe looking at happiness index, Bhutan, ideas like that, to have maybe a country or a culture-specific extra dimension of an index? Or would you actually say, no, there is actually no universal comparison, no universal yardstick for measuring good societies or development possible at all? What is your position?
Not now. We said we collect, and then all of you have one final say. So.
Yes, please. So I'm a researcher from the South, but not necessarily looked at. But I find it very interesting, and some of the tensions, particularly come to your presentation around, was that the role of donor funding and how the donor architecture is created entrenches these asymmetries. So I work on a project that's funded by a research council in Canada and a foreign development agency in Canada. We effectively are the enumerators. There's 5 or 6 postdocs in every project and PhDs who are writing up the work that has been mined through our work. So in this kind of asymmetry that you present, I imagine it happens in all disciplines. So I suppose my comment is, and I think it's what's informing UNDP and things like that. So there's this knowledge, but it's being sort of filtered and abstracted into becoming a sort of perspective of development, and how do we engage as a broad question? How do we unpack that? Is that embodied in the UNDP, in the SDGs? All of the, so a very broad question, but how the kind of follow the money kind of logic in terms of how that then and then what is the role of Southern researchers to deny access to opportunity, which is often the only access they get for research, scholarships, etc. So just the question around sort of broader development architecture.
Following from Gareth's point, I think it's also interesting, reflecting on all the papers, how each of them plays in different ways with the approach of sort of structuration theory of structure and agency that one doesn't hear very much about these days. But in all of the kinds of contexts, I think one of the key questions is to what extent structure predetermines and constrains, and to what extent it allows or the actors can seize and exploit spaces to exert agencies. And I heard examples of all of it to different extents in the papers, but it seemed to me actually one of the unacknowledged sort of silences of the set of papers as a set. So I'd invite some comment on that.
Thank you. Well, I think these are three very fundamental interventions, and if there is not more, then it leaves sufficient time for all four presenters, because you all can in some degree relate to these questions raised, these very fundamental questions, which also acknowledge that you all have cross-cutting issues where I also had the papers to read, and after reading them it dawned on me how closely they are related, even if at the first sight I thought, okay, mixed bag. And then when after reading them I thought, no, it's not a mixed bag. It's really something that goes into each other. So please, I think we do it in the order of how you present it. So Juan, now it's your turn.
About culture, two ideas what you were asking. I think analyzing how the UNDP understands culture is really interesting because it generates a lot of contradictions. The UNDP necessarily has to be politically correct. So officially, explicitly, every culture is positive. But then, as defending my position that their background is evolutionist, they think that one culture is the good one. So when you read, like reading between lines what they say when they speak about culture, you find a lot of contradictions. Every culture is positive, but if it fits within my culture, something like this. And about measuring culture or creating more broader index, I think it's not possible. What I would ask the UNDP to do is just be aware that what they produce is not objective, it's just one perspective. Only that, like trying at least being applying this reflexivity to their work, which I think is not like that, because otherwise you don't produce global reports saying human development is this and we measure it like this and this is what it is. So I would ask for more reflexivity. That's my point.
Christina?
Yeah, I think in my case, I'm not sure if we should call it culture, but what I saw was that when foreign donors did not sort of like the culture of the local NGOs that were already there working on rule of law, or other, lawyers that were acting as intermediaries, they often did not like their sort of apologetic stance towards the military regime or their views on the rights for the Rohingya. So what the foreign donors would do then instead is that they would create new NGOs that they would try to describe and call local, but they were actually bypassing existing organizations that were already there, or they would take these younger generation and educate them and try to get them on their side. So I think that's my reference to foreign organizations sort of not liking the sort of culture they were met with. So I'm not sure that's answering your question exactly, but that's a comment along those lines.
Thank you. Anything else you want to say?
No, thanks. not on that.
Esther?
Yeah, okay. What can I say? Maybe on that point of the NGOs, I can say that it's also, and maybe in that line also with prejudice, that it's also important to lost my point. When looking at the influence of NGOs, for example, in the field I'm looking at solidarity structures in the Ugandan communities. So it is also important to be careful not to look at, not to create dichotomies or to romanticize what we are looking at, like saying there are the African solidarity structures on that side and there are NGOs and development on the other side, because there are many spaces where they meet, many solidarity groups that turn out to be produced by NGOs, or many comments from interviewees being very positive about development as modeled by the global north. So I think it is very important to have a close look at such things and to look at the epistemologies, at the knowledge systems that are behind.
Thanks. Angie?
If I start off with the Gareth's point, I think your question was what's the role of then low middle income countries in this asymmetry. I think in sort of these conversations that we have been having, we've been focusing a lot on what do the high income countries need to do. In my own research, I actually find it lopsided if we just look at what is the high income country contribution to this idea of reinforcing this asymmetry. I think the low income country actually has to meet halfway. So what I do is I actually interview both the high income country and low middle income country partners in my research, and often I find that the low middle income country partner, whilst the high income country believe that they are the provider of the knowledge, low middle income country partner tends to also reinforce this by believing in this West is best narrative. So without them owning their spaces and realizing that they have something to contribute, it's going to be very hard to ask high income countries to start realigning their thinking to this new way of thinking. So I believe when we're thinking about post-colonialism, that low middle income countries have a huge role in also redefining the way that they think and their contribution and their spaces, and that they're not reinforcing this narrative. I think to your point about the structures and how much it really constructs this type of thinking, which is very true. Within my PhD as well, I look at something called institutional theory, and it teaches us that our organizational environment really dictates how organizations behave, and because the environment tends to, so for example, our funding structures, especially in the research space, it's very hard to be innovative because everyone's looking for a pot of money, and if the funding structures dictate what type of research you're doing, you end up creating organizations that are much of the same, and that is a huge problem. And we do need to sort of have more research that sort of challenges the structures in itself. If I just give you a quick example, my supervisor in our team has just been awarded a sum of money at Imperial College London to actually work on this idea of decolonizing knowledge. So what we're doing is it's going to be decolonizing the Masters for Public Health program at Imperial College London, and the idea is we're actually going to be studying the whole sort of learning curriculum for the Masters of Public Health, and we're going to do a review of all the educational material and understand where are the predominant perspectives from within our teaching, and to explore sort of are there any opportunities to redress the balance where there may need to, where we need to include low income country scholars in certain spaces. It's not this belief that you have to have sort of this 50-50, because you have to also appreciate that in certain research areas, perhaps the person that they do have speaking is the person best for that role. So it's just understanding where do we need to readjust those balances. So it's actually, I think it's one of the, even though a lot of people are talking about decolonizing the academic institution, I think this sort of research project that we're working on is actually, perhaps, if I'm not wrong, is perhaps one of the first academic institutions that are actually going to be trying to decolonize a whole master's course, and really look at exploring ways that we can talk to the faculty members. And also what we're going to be doing is actually going to be giving some cognitive psychology tests to these to the faculty members, to the students as well, to help them sort of be aware of their biases before they start the MPH program. and then just sort of seeing then how they can challenge sort of any biases they have against lower income country research. So I think we need more research into actually tackling sort of these structures, because at the end of the day, it's very true. It's these structures that redefine and sort of reinforce the issues that we're trying to move away from. And if we don't tackle the structures, it's going to be very hard for us to move away from these spaces.
Thank you. Christina?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment on the other questions, I realized. And if I have time, I think so.
I thought so, that's why I asked you in the first place.
I know, I forgot, or I thought you were one of the questions. Okay, I'll just take 30 seconds. So I think in terms of the role of, I think your question was what role for the researchers from non-Western countries that are being supported by donor programs, right? And I think in my case, what I see and what I would like to see more of is that these researchers that are being educated abroad, for example, return to their home countries and become recognized as experts and not just intermediaries or translators, which sometimes happens, that they're being employed by the donor again, but not in a real expert position, but rather as some sort of facilitator because they're bilingual and all of that. And I think with the structure question, which is a very interesting theory I want to look into more, but what I also saw in the field was that a lot of the foreign practitioners, they had these predetermined idea of how the structure of development were working. So they would get upset with me, for example, when I suggested that maybe your local staff is, facing a lot more challenges than what they tell you about. And no, that's not the way we do development. We're exactly on the same page. Our local staff tells us everything that's going on, and then of course my research discovered that that's not actually the case. So maybe the structure was not the way the foreign practitioners thought it was. Thanks.
Thanks. That leaves me 2 minutes to try and wrap up without hopefully repeating too much. Juan, you started with your development or development as culture. And throughout the paper, you very much stressed the prerequisite of a critical interrogation of our own premises. And in the debate, actually, you were courageous enough to ask the question almost rhetorically if we can decolonize development at all. And I think it's quite a thought-provoking question with which all of us should leave that room. I think it's a relevant and it's a legitimate question, because we should not pretend that we are able to do something which actually, if we are quite honest, we're not really certain if we can really achieve that. That would be part of the critical interrogation of their own premises and putting our possible roles into maybe a realistic perspective as a point of departure. So a certain modesty which maybe is good for all of us in judging what we want to do and how we do it. Christina, you highlighted the role of intermediaries and how to navigate spaces, and that this is a negotiating process. And it is about values. And it dawned on me that you discuss multiple identities, which is a common thing we share. David started his keynote yesterday making reference to multiple identities. I listened to someone making reference as a voice from the South to Canada, but with a clearly South African accent. I hope I'm not wrong. So, even among us who look alike, the three of us, there are obviously beyond the surface multiple identities, which poses the question, is that a case of brokerage? And which is not limited to the intermediaries, Christina, you make reference to. They have multiple identities. Maybe they are brokers, they are dealers, and they are at the same time another filter, because they are also in between us, like we are, like many others are. So it's actually even more complicated than it sounds. Maybe at the same time also comforting, because it also takes a little bit of the pressure, because if you say we are all navigating through different forms of hybridity, okay, that's actually rather comforting. It increases the risk that you might be wrong, but it also reduces the risk that you might be wrong, because you're aware that you can be wrong, if you understand the dialectic. So, in that sense, I think multiple identities is something we don't only have to recognize in the others, but in us as a point of departure of the self-critical reflections. Esther, you present the complementing case of that, because you focus on the spaces in between. And you emphasize, again, like Juan in a different context, the need for self-reflexivity. And you highlight exactly the same dilemma we are always confronted with. Damned if you do, damned if we don't. So, should we then say avoiding the risk of doing something which might not have the impact we would like to have, we do nothing? That comes back to the rather realistic, almost sobering conclusion of your keynote yesterday, David, to say, yeah, well, we need to have these self-reflections, but they shouldn't paralyze us in the sense that nothing happens except we reflect about ourselves. Mm-hmm. Is that the kind of development? Then it would be development for us as individuals. Other things might go wrong, but then if you do, then if you don't. On the same problem, however, is while you try to be very aware of the limitations, you still promote a way of giving others voice through us. But at the end result, it remains our voice. We can try to give others a voice, but we do it through our voice, and it remains our voice. And I think that's the first thing to start with, to be aware of it remains our voice, even if we try to provide a floor. That's where Hamdi comes into the picture. With the asymmetric ignorance, I think it's a very important term. I learned a lot about making that. And I, for the first time, became aware that health issues are not only health issues. Wow, it was an eye-opener. I thought, well, exactly, the underlying method, the approach, is something that's not confined to health issues. So the asymmetric ignorances we need to identify in the first place, and then try to reduce. And then you make another thing which I think, a proposal which I think is extremely constructive also to end with, because you talk about cognitive justice. And the space which at the same time should be aware of the limits. You create space, but at the same time you're aware it doesn't solve the problem. It only provides new ways to become more aware of the limits of all knowledge systems. There is not a singular knowledge system, be it indigenous, be it Eurocentric, be it what, you name it, which is superior to other knowledge systems. Now, this co-presence of all forms of knowledge, which in the particular concrete example you use as a thinking space you can create, that's actually the encouraging thing for me to conclude this exchange. Because we can say, with all our limitations, we might be able to contribute one aspect of the co-presence of all forms of knowledge, which might be hybrid, which might be us in our complexity, each of us very genuine, like anyone else very genuine. So we only have very limited representation, even if we claim we stand in certain traditions. And maybe it makes all of us negotiators, intermediaries, and brokers. And I think I can live with that. And I hope you can live with that.
Great.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.